I think Christianity once understood non-duality, although we never used that word. The word in mainline was unitive consciousness. But non-dual describes it very well. When I wrote my book, The Naked Now, where I was trying to introduce this word to Christians, I expected a whole lot of pushback because, Richard's become a Buddhist or a Hindu, as if that's bad, but that would have been the criticisms I would have expected. And they never came. And it's almost as if it was a liberation for a lot of Christians, at least a lot of Christians who were sincerely seeking. So I'm going to give you, and I hope it won't be boring or belabored, but a little bit of the history of how we had it, how we lost it, why we lost it, and why it's being so magnificently retrieved in our time. But it's still unknown to the vast majority of Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant Christians. Especially, I have to say, the Protestant tradition, because it came along so late. It wasn't its fault, but it's no accident. We celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation, of course, this year. It was simultaneous with the invention of the printing press. And we're all historical accidents in so many ways. Of course, the printing press made us for 500 years enamored with words. And words are inherently dualistic. That isn't a put down. I'm using words right now. We need words, but they are to distinguish this from that. And once your concentration is to use words to distinguish yourself or clarify your thought, you move toward argumentativeness, endless clarification of what did that word really mean. And so we see that the older traditions were much more, as we just heard so beautifully, body-based, intuitive-based, based in poetry and dance and music and art. All primitive religion, which now we see maybe was not so primitive, seemed to understand this, that we have to move to a different level of consciousness. Now, I'm convinced the very word prayer, which of course all of us have heard all of our lives, but originally meant a different operating system. Christians will still say, I'm going to pray about that. Now, I think what they mean is I got to get out of my argumentative, dualistic, egocentric mind and put on a mind that is bigger, broader, more accessible, as the heart math solution teaches us. I don't think I see any evidence that Jesus ever systematically taught what we would call non-dual thinking. But he did exemplify it, right? And that's even better, when he says, I and the Father are one, his classic line of unitive consciousness with God, he says it without any apology. And of course, even then, he is called bad names for making such a daring assertion. When he says things like, my Father's sun shines on the bad and the good. His rain falls on the just and the unjust. Or when you must love your neighbor as yourself, what you do to the least of the brothers and sisters you do to me. It's unitive consciousness all over the place. And how we, in organized Christianity, got in trouble is we largely read, and I mean largely, overwhelmingly, read the words of Jesus, who was talking non-dually, mystically, if I now use those words almost interchangeably. We read him with a dualistic mind, an argumentative mind, which meant from the get-go to misunderstand what he was talking about. So we see the first great, I think, separation from the much more, you read Jesus' metaphors and examples, 90% of them are all nature-based. He isn't an academic teacher using concepts and ideas like, I'm afraid, I'm doing now. But he is referring to the natural world and using this to exemplify universal truths, much closer to what we later disparagingly called paganism. But the pagani, and I'm sure this is from Italian, probably, it simply meant the people who lived out in the country. It wasn't a put down. It was that the cities got Christianized first, and those who lived out in the country were the pagani or the pagans. And that for centuries became a put down. Well, he's a pagan, which usually meant he or she was a moral degenerate or something, but it actually might mean someone who's much closer to what we later called natural theology. But after the Word, we moved into anything but natural theology. It was in many ways very unnatural. So we have Jesus exemplifying it. And the first great compromise, if I can call it that, and I'm sure you've heard of this from various preachers, and although Roman Catholics, like I am, usually don't admit it, but our first great compromise was called the Constantinian Compromise. That in around 313, we moved from the catacombs to the basilicas. We moved from the lower class to the upper class. We moved to an identification with power and money and war. That's why we were called Roman Catholics, because the Roman Empire pretty much took over the show. And we needed an imperial God who could unify Europe and the Middle East. And you know what? This name, and I emphasize name, this name Jesus fit the bill, even though it had almost nothing to do with his teaching, and in many ways was absolutely contrary to his teaching. I mean, any of you familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, you can't make that by any stretch of the imagination into an imperial worldview or an exclusionary worldview, or a mental worldview. It's entirely intuitive, love-based, nature-based, community-based, unitive consciousness, if you will. But that's when Maurizio mentioned monks were actually called friars. Doesn't make a great deal of difference, but the friars lived in the city with the people. The monks usually lived out in the country. But it all starts after that great compromise in 313, where we move into the upper class, into imperial thinking. And so huge amounts of Western Christians go off to the deserts of Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Cappadocia, which is eastern Turkey. And there is where Christianity flourished, plus these little outlying places like Ireland and Scotland, which were not a part of the Roman Empire. That's why there's so much fascination with much more nature-based Celtic spirituality today. It wasn't Romanized. So when the Protestant Reformation comes along, and it was much needed, I'm not here to put that down at all, it brought a kind of critical thinking to a Catholicism that didn't have, at that point, much self-critical thinking. It moved us in a very different direction, you might say. But I would say after the desert period, what we would call unitive thinking or non-dual thinking, or the balancing of knowing with not knowing, is only systematically taught in some monasteries where it maintains some form of identity. And it was usually taught in this way, and this might be a central point that will help you understand. Forgive these two big words, but there were two main lines of spirituality inside of formal Christianity. One was called the cataphatic way, whereby you knew through words and concepts and ideas and clarity, through light, through knowing. But it was balanced in this magnificent biblical concept of faith, which evolved inside the Bible itself. It was balanced by the apophatic way, which means knowing by not knowing, or not needing to know, knowing through darkness. We got to be honest. The whole mystical tradition of knowing through darkness that we see in Dionysius in the early centuries, in the cloud of unknowing in the 14th century, for the last 500 years, once we got into the food fights of the Reformation, and that's what they were, all right? We're right and you're wrong. Our denomination is saved and your denomination is not saved. I'm going to make a strong statement, but I don't think it's much of an overstatement. That was the death of the contemplative mind. Once you need to prove that you're right and someone else is wrong, that you're the in group and they're the out group, what you have is the dominance of ego. And once the ego is center stage, no possibility of contemplation. It's all about you. It's all self-referential, and thinking declines.